yeah, we might have missed a few gems, but when it ended, I got back on and I re-recorded the whole thing about the basics. So that was a long Sunday for me. But yeah, I appreciate you guys taking time out of your day, um, hang out with me for a little bit and talk around training intensity and recovery. And this is such a, I guess, component of flexibility training that's not really talked about as much. And I've tried to last year or so present it in different ways and create those discussions around it and within training too, even just around the lens of like deloading and starting to think about those kind of things. And yeah, I really wanted to hone in on two specific topics today that I think will make things a lot more clear for you. One with regards to just static stretching in general. So thinking about training intensity around static stretching, as it's really deemed as just like a very passive endeavor, something that wouldn't even be considered in most scenarios. So we're going to talk a little bit around the soft skills of static stretching because that's really what's missing when it comes to static stretching is the soft skills of coaching it, teaching it, and applying it. And if we look to other camps of training, this is what stretch therapy does really well. It's it's their biggest strength is they take the soft skills of a static stretch or stretching in general, and they just isolate that to the degree of it's really the focus. Like the time doesn't even really matter. Um, you hear a lot of people talking about being at a seminar with Kit Laughlin, and he walks you through a stretch, and next thing you know, you're holding a stretch for like over 5 minutes. It's so not about how long you hold the stretch, but more about what's happening in those softer skills. So I do want to hone in on that with regards to static stretching today, because I think that is so invaluable and very overlooked. And then I do want to tie in the flexibility strength protocol, which is really, it's kind of like the essence of range of strength when it comes to training flexibility. In that presentation, um, if you've been training with me for a long time, you've seen it presented in a couple of ways where it's strength training under the lens of flexibility. And presenting that obviously has held me more accountable to how I present that. And so you present these things and these new ideas, and people train them and have great results, and it's you see things happening. But for the ongoing and for the long term, how should we think about training intensity and how that applies to the protocol in such a way where we know we're progressing accordingly and we're making smart choices. We're not just, I guess, sprinting all the time, right? Like, how do we do this for the long haul? Um, and then along with that, I'm going to present some newer research that's coming out and some individuals are experimenting with. And one of our members actually shared this with me a couple weeks ago with regards to this call, Mercedes Polymer. So you guys know her as Modus Athletica. If you follow her on Instagram, she's a climber and she has gotten very deep into flexibility training for climbing. And I want to go over some of that research that she shared with me, and it aligns a lot with the protocol type mentality. So it is cool to start seeing that some research is coming out to show that this is actually a thing that we should consider when it comes to, I guess, less time and flexibility training, where flexibility training is looked as like, stretch for an hour to kind of see results. This is starting to show that, there's certain things that we can consider in a different way when it comes to that. So that's what today's call will focus on. And I think it'll tie in all the questions that did come up in the Mighty Network with what people had with regards to this, maybe except for Kat's question about the knee mobility. So I'll tie in some discussion about the knee mobility strategies that I've used and considerations for that. I think it's something that you're dealing with too, Kat, like you have really hypermobile knees. So yeah, within that too, I think the programming that you and I have been doing together has been something I've been considering and how you approach certain aspects of that. So we'll talk a little bit about that and then open discussion around the things that we're sharing. So I'm going to start with the static stretching piece. So I'll share my screen here. One sec. Always double checking that I'm still recording. So we're still good. Good. So like I had said there, the thing I want to focus on with the static stretching as it relates to how we think about progressing training intensity and some of those recovery pieces. We're going to focus on those softer skills of what that looks like. It's not really presented very much and discussed. It's more, those general guidelines, hold the stretch for this long, contractions for this long, kind of recommendations. So first thing we'll talk about is the rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is that you got to hold the stretch before you move. So this is something we don't really think about coaching or maybe even applying, but it's certainly something that I really try to highlight with everybody that is intimately coaching with me. Or if you look going through the programs, you'll see that we have to hold the stretch first before we think about contractions. And this is super important, this rule of thumb, because if we want to learn how to static stretch, we have to be in the stretch. You guys, probably have experiences with that yourself. I certainly do. Like when I started getting deeper into training flexibility and improving my flexibility, I realized I just had never actually stretched because I hadn't gotten in a position and held the stretch for a duration without moving. So this is a very important piece when it comes to the static stretch, is knowing that if we're thinking about the intensity of the stretch, it has to accumulate. So this is where a lot of people make those disconnects, is that they look for intensity right away. So I'm going to get in a couch stretch position and I'm going to search for intensity. I want to feel the stretch. But when you're in a stretch position, you are in a stretch position that has to be assessed over time. So the first rule of thumb is that we hold even if we don't feel anything. And I usually mark that around the 30-second mark. So around a 30-second mark, if you still don't really feel like anything is happening, you haven't felt any kind of stretch sensations occur, then we can consider adjusting to move deeper into the stretch. Most static stretch prescriptions are going to be 60 seconds or more. So those first 30 seconds gives us an opportunity to settle into the stretch and then think about contractions and what kind of contractions we should be prescribing or looking at. There's some contraction techniques presented in the collection course now that I've shared in the emails as well, that you can kind of go through and see kind of examples of the ones that I like to use the most. There's plenty out there, but for the most part, a lot of them are the same, asymmetric contractions against and with the stretch. But this rule of thumb is something that we want to apply in the static stretch scenario. So first rule of thumb, we hold the stretch, we don't move, and we see how the body accumulates intensity in the stretch over time, because then we can evaluate how much harder we should go. And the scenario may be that you get in the stretch, you don't feel anything, but then after 30 seconds, you're like, holy shit, I really feel this stretch. So should you adjust? You know that you have to now hold it for 2 more minutes or for 90 more seconds. Maybe adjusting isn't the right move right now. So then you actually learn how to be in the stretch and to feel the stretch sensation accumulate over time. When we think about that RPE chart that I have presented, we don't want to, I guess, think a bit about it as like something that's like concrete in stone. It's like it has to be followed this way. But think of it more about developing a intensity language with your body in a stretch. So how does the stretch feel? We want it to feel like this. This is a very important piece to the static stretch. And RPE chart has helped me relay that message to clients and relay that message to people that I'm training, especially online, where it's harder to always be present and there with them. In a one-on-one scenario, it's always going to be a little bit easier to navigate someone's body language. But one of the pieces that we would be thinking about is like really learning to develop this intensity language with our bodies. So if we look at the RPE chart now and we say, and we see that it says, 7 is a mild discomfort. Okay, that's a really important message to relay to the body, is that we don't want to be feeling like we're at a threshold in static stretch. It's a mild discomfort. So you set up the position, whatever the stretch sensation should be. Do you feel mild discomfort? Yes, I do. Then you're at a 7. So you begin to learn and understand that language with your own body and how to increase upon that. Going to a 7.5, we're approaching new levels of discomfort. Going to an 8, that's where we start to feel like, okay, maybe I can only do this for 10 more seconds. So in this way, we can start developing that language of intensity in a static stretch rather than just holding the stretch. So that intensity could be monitored. So if you think about that, it doesn't always have to be just moving deeper in a stretch either, right? Because that's always the thought process, is like, okay, for it to be more intense, I have to go deeper. Not necessarily. We understand the contraction types in the stretch. The crack method imposes the agonist antagonistic contractions. And even just having a bit more intent and focus on that could apply those intensity markers that we're looking for. And then strategies to increase the intensity. So this is up for discussion. If you guys have different techniques you've used, it's a troubleshoot, right? Like we have to experiment in different ways with how we increase the intensity of a stretch, because it isn't subjective to just putting more weight on the bar and just having a very specific marker of intensity. So a couple of strategies that I've presented in the training intensity recovery status overview, it shows a wave load. And a wave load for a static stretch really doesn't move us to a really high degree of intensity. But if you think about over 3 weeks, going from a 7, which is a mild discomfort, to a 7.5, which is new levels of discomfort, to an 8, which is like a bit, we're approaching a threshold. Like I could hold for 10 more seconds. And then coming back around to doing that again at a new level of this mild discomfort. So it's a thought process. Like really, it's like over that kind of wave load of a static stretch, we're still probably in the same window of intensity, but we're just slowly introducing new levels of stretch sensation. And that's what we want to do through contractions and through going deeper into a stretch. We could also consider 3-week blocks of intensity. So imagine maybe someone is very new to static stretching and stretching in general, and they're overwhelmed by all these ideas of intensity. I just want to actually learn how to be in a stretch. I've never really done it before. Maybe they're very limited in their capabilities and what they can do. 3-week blocks could be another option, where over the duration of 3 weeks, you're holding the stretch intensity at a 7. So it's more constant. And Cesare brought this up in a question he had about, that continuous intensity with that like neural activation is similar to strength training, which a lot of this is very similar to strength training. So if you're thinking about how we apply the stretches and contractions, a lot of it does relate back to strength training methodologies. Within the static stretch, we may be thinking more about a longer window of time under tension. So 60 seconds plus, upwards of 3 minutes even. This 3-week block may be a consideration for that, where it's 3 weeks at 7, 3 weeks at 8, 3 weeks at 9, and then kind of flipping back around. And then that exposure method. So often the scenario as well in a static stretch is that someone just can't go any deeper. We're stuck for a long time. So maybe a 3-week block of like the same position is a very good option for them. And then a period or a week in general, where we expose them to a further range of motion and then drop back. And I've talked about this before in other teachings and lessons about almost like a drop set. It's like you go into the set at a high intensity. So you get into a high intensity position right away within the stretch, hold it for a shorter duration, and then you scale back to that zone of intensity or RPE intensity that you want to be working at. And in that way, you're like slowly exposing, the body does have to be exposed to a new level of the stretch, like searching for improvements. This is something that we want to get over, and we want to start finding ways to introduce someone to that. So the scenario may be that someone is very blocked and they can't go deeper into the stretch for quite some time. We just monitor periods of exposing them to new method or new ranges of motion, and then scale back down like a drop set. So before we go to the next piece, you guys have any thoughts around static stretching? So those are, some softer skills for the static stretch that don't get talked about very much. Holding the stretch first for around 30 seconds, progressively introducing someone to some more intensity within a stretch through contractions or moving deeper in a stretch. Have you experienced that yourself?
Yeah, for me, I'm still trying to stop myself from going all the way to my max range. like for my front splits, I'm like, I know I can go deeper. So I get a little like that. So it's really good to like have that 30 seconds, and then if I don't feel something, then go down. So that's definitely a note I'm taking out of this.
Yeah, those rules of thumbs are super important. Because then it's not always like, oh, we do this before. It's like, no, you have to hold it for this amount of time before you even make an adjustment to actually know that we're going to go deeper or decide to do something further. You got a thought there, Joel?
Yeah, always. I mean, it's interesting because the discipline of stretching, from what I've come from, isn't really the way that everybody here is probably most used to it. It is a lot of sitting in static stretches and not trying to push intensity for a lot of time. And it's actually more about convincing my students that they are going to need to start putting some intensity into it. Like they're sitting there and they just got their legs open, and I'm like, okay, that's good. It's nice that you're now like pretty comfortable down there. But if you're going to expect us to get better, you can't just come and sit here with your legs open week in and week out,
Yeah.
and trying to get some methods which feel like, attainable, don't feel too scary. I mean, this is where language, I think, definitely comes into it as well,
Yeah.
where they feel like, look, you can go much harder, I can tell, and it doesn't need to be a scary thing. You just need to start kind of trying to feel what it's like to maybe contract into that stretch, or to use a little bit of gravity to help you just see what it's like to go deeper without that. I mean, it's the involuntary contractions is the thing too, right? They start to let themselves, and you see they're tensing up so much. I'm like, well, now, like, that's kind of where you need to be now, where you feel like you can't relax, and then now chill out there for a minute or two and see if you can relax there.
Yeah. And can you tell the other members on the call what it is, the discipline that you?
Oh, yeah. So I do like Chinese martial arts, so mainly Tai Chi and Shaolin Kung Fu.
Yeah.
In this
Very
regard.
cool stuff. We did a demonstration there during the teacher training. It's tough stuff because you're learning how to create tension in different ways too, in the way that you're introducing it with movements. Like we're having the tension with the limb extended like a fist and coming back in and relaxing with the breath. And in my experience with doing your class, I was focusing on like so many other things when you were talking about the breathing and the tension with that kind of movement, that I like just went deeper and had, more, I guess, intensity applied with not focusing on my horse stance specifically, but some of the movements we were doing in it.
Yeah, I mean, that must be a part of it, right? It's like a distraction
Yeah.
technique where you put someone in a horse stance and then you start talking and you start getting them to do a bunch of movements and think about softness in the hands. And then suddenly they realize, like, shit, I've just been in horse stance for like 4 minutes. Like, that's why my legs are shaking.
Yeah. And that's the hardest part, right? Like getting into a stretch and like trying to figure out how to, I guess, occupy the mind. And I would relate it to like putting a barbell on my back and sitting in a squat and just sitting there. That's going to be just as hard as holding a stretch. And I would want to occupy my mind in that scenario as well, right? Like I want to think about breathing, my technique. And that's where we get lost in the static stretch stuff. Is we don't coach technique, we don't coach breathing, we don't coach the language of intensity. And that's where I see, things like that RPE chart coming into play the most for us, is like coaching the language. It's like, we just want to feel a mild discomfort right now. We don't want to feel like we're going to our max range. And then, next session, it's like, okay, remember what 7 felt like? Now we're going to go 7.5, and it's going to be outside of that mild discomfort. So it's like learning the language that person needs to learn with their own body, and then us learning to do that as well. If we are coaching someone, right? So learning the language ourselves with our own body, learning how to relay that message as well.
I think that's such an interesting part too, because I reckon I can convey that message to somebody much better than I can relay it to myself. Like when I'm watching someone else and I'm doing, like, it's so clear what they need to do, whatever. But when I'm with myself, it's always like, okay, 10, just go to 10.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it is important to have a coach. And like the last splits workout you did, and you shared a clip with me, it's like, before I even offer insight, I want to start talking to you about your own language of intensity in that session. So like, what were you pushing at? That looks good, and this looks good, but how? And I think that's an important thing to think about, right? Is like having someone question you a little bit on that, so we can better learn to question ourselves on those intensities as well. I'm the same though. I think that's why the groundfulness piece has become such a big part of like the basics program, and with a lot of the things we're doing, because I've really needed that too. Always training at those high intensities and not just learning to be in the position, even if it's not at a high intensity, right? That's something that we want to practice.
What I think is maybe interesting there as well is I'm so used to applying the scale to when it's high intensity and I'm trying to dial things back, but not using the scale when I'm doing something like that and assessing like, okay, I'm just sitting on the floor and doing this, like, what is this on the scale? Like, this is just a
Yeah.
6 or whatever, and getting used to what the low intensity stuff actually feels like too, not just using it as a way to be like, you're going too far, dial it back.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, because it's in different lenses. Static stretch, and then I wouldn't even think of a static side split as a static stretch. Really, it's a strength. It's a high intensity strength exercise. So the intensity is going to be there right away. So now we have to think about the intensity of that in a different way. But it's always usually going to be above some of those lower intensities, just because we're there and we know we have to work so hard for it. Any other thoughts around the static stretching piece before we go into the thoughts on the strength protocol? Cool. Okay.
Yeah, Lucas, can you hear me?
Yeah. What's up, Gabe?
Yeah. So I was thinking of the three-week blocks that you were talking about earlier, and I find that's also a good way to come back from injury as well, relating to the hamstring strain that I had. That would have been a great strategy to reintroduce myself to flexibility training for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And in those scenarios, well, I would relay that scenario to someone who's new to stretching as well. Is if we start introducing the thought of increasing intensity all the time right away, then that's like always our focus. And we don't think about just like the, I guess, 3-week block method, or just like the maintaining an intensity over a period of time. So that could be, something to consider. Introducing someone to flexibility. Don't worry about intensity. Just feel mild discomfort for 3 weeks. And understand and be in these positions and learn how to contract. Okay, then 3-week block. It's like, okay, now let's move beyond that mild discomfort, but feel like we can complete all the sets. But we actually feel like, so it's definitely maybe harder for some to comprehend who want instant gratification from their work. But if you present these things to someone right away, we're going to maintain this intensity for 3 weeks. A 12-week block of training is not a long time. You can push someone upwards to some threshold by the end of 12 weeks. And then returning back from a strain, that would be a great strategy, especially if Gabe was, training at a high level of intensity, chasing splits, front split, side split, doing all these things. That can be a bit of a mind mess with you. If you have that strain, you're like, okay, how do I come back into this with some mindset of, having structure in my training? I've always been thinking about the intensity piece. It's like, I'll just maintain this type of intensity for a longer duration, apply those contractions and apply those pieces to it. So yeah, that's a good one, Gabe. Thanks for bringing that up. Where am I? So the flexibility strength protocol, I thought this would be really good to just bring in as well with this conversation, because it's a newer concept, really. Like, I'm trying to figure out how to bring more pieces into this, like why we want to train flexibility in this way. I think, some of that research that we'll look at will start getting us all thinking about how that is kind of playing a role. But better understanding the intensities of a flexibility strength protocol and the intent behind it is super important. Because if we don't understand these pieces of it, we'll end up doing, a similar thing where we are training a high intensity through the whole protocol all the time. And that's not necessarily what the intention is with the protocol. So let's take a look at the concept of the protocol. So a 3 to 4 movement-based circuit And within that circuit, there really is only one main movement, and that main movement is more outer range specific. Then there is an antagonistic movement, so it's an opposing action. And then a concentric movement, which we can think about that movement being end range agonistic, concentric focused. And within the constraints of that, there is basically all the pieces to like what a static stretch would do, but now looking through the lens of strength. In this concept, intensity through a training block is specific to the main movement. So now if you have been training with me for a long time, and you think about some of the earlier presentations of the protocol, we kind of just went hard on everything, right? It was like we were doing a circuit. But now if we pull back the curtain a little bit and look at it through a lens of like long-term application, having that intensity piece, we would only want to be thinking about doing that through a main movement. And this is what I've been doing with a lot of clients now, is to say, if we're doing, say, 3 movements, and for example, in a front split protocol or sagittal plane protocol, we have a long lunge, a good morning action or a hinging action, and an end range hip flexor action. The only movement from there that we would be thinking about applying intensity over time to would be the long lunge, and the other variables are more maintained. Because what they're doing is they're assisting the main movement and helping us create more space in that movement. Every 6 weeks, that full protocol gets adjusted and progressed based on like how we're doing with that. So if we think about the protocol that way now, and maybe like Cesare, with your experience there, where we were talking about like having issues controlling the intensity, this would be a better way for us to think about controlling intensity within the protocol concept. So we don't have to think about pushing intensity on all of the movements, but we choose the one movement that we should be considering intensity increases on, whether it be RPE, volume, load, what have you, and view the other movements as assistive movements that are going to help us create more space, because that's really what happens at the end of the protocol, right? Like if you guys have done strength protocol methods for flexibility, like I've presented, you go through 3 to 5 rounds of this protocol, and at the end you're like, holy smokes, like I have all this range in my long lunge or what have you, and now we can use that as an opportunity to static stretch, and we can do something with that range. So does that make sense, guys? It's like maybe something like, I haven't maybe presented the protocol this way enough, and I've realized that, like coming back to like, you know, the protocol works so good and there's so many good pieces to it, but what is missing? And the missing piece is that the longevity of it is that we just can't go hard on all the movements. We're going to take one main movement, it's outer range specific, higher intensity in that lens, and then have the other actions be assistive. And as we come back around, we create that space that we're looking for. So any questions on that? You guys have all probably seen this in different forms, in different programs.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I've been using similar approach these days. I mean, not exactly like this, but I am focusing mostly on one movement, which is one of the kind of one of the big six that we used to use and stuff like this. And then I just add on little spices on top of it, like, antagonistic, strength, and so on. It works well. And yes, it's easier to control the intensity on some particular movements than on the other ones. So in this way, it works. I'm just curious, could you give an example? I don't know, maybe in the next slide is an example of exactly this protocol idea that you've got here. What would that be exactly with exercises and so on?
I didn't put one in the next slide. We could talk about a few on the call, and then I'll add this to that training intensity piece in the collection, and I'll put a few examples in there. But yeah, the sagittal plane front split example would be one where a long lunge and a hinge and an end range hip flexor works really well. We see that one getting used a lot. Pancake. So if we think about a pancake or straddle fold type of protocol, we could have a pancake pulse, a straddle leg lift. So getting that straddle hip abducted and range concentric piece to it. And then something that's a little more specific to rotators. So,
and how would you add into this some sort of inner range work kind of a thing? Like, for example, like in the pancake, let's say pancake pulses, and then add to it the adductors lifts or whatever, and then actually abductors lifts. And then I was thinking about how to add to this some sort of adductors work or something like that. Would that make sense to just add in some inner range strength, so-called?
yeah, that piece here you see on the slide, concentric focused movement, we could consider that inner range focus. So it could be strength curve specific. But I didn't like putting a label on that specifically because it could change based on the type of flexibility work we're doing and what is needed. So if we always think inner range, it might not be what is needed in that scenario, but think something that is concentric focused, where it's not moving us through full ranges of movement, and it's concentric to some aspect of that piece of range that we're looking to get deeper into. So that would be, yeah, I would look at that piece and think about how you would individualize this. And this is the thing, right? Is look at what the person's capable of. In the scenario of maybe a pancake, they might need more hip abduction strength. So the protocol can become very focused on strengthening that. It doesn't even have to have the pancake component into it. We could have a check-in at the start and end to show how that work is helping and getting us into that space. And then the thought process with a lot of the training now that you're seeing on the new platform is that after a protocol, rather than calling it quits and saying that's it, we're trying to use that time where now we have more access to the space and the plane that we're looking to get stronger in, to perform some of the static stretching and to perform some of the, the deeper range work where we're getting into some focused holds and contractions and static stretches. So that would be what I'd be looking at there, Cesar. Doesn't have to necessarily be inner range, but just think concentric focused. It'd be a very concentric focused agonistic movement. And that gives you more options too. It's good to have more options. Any other thoughts on this, guys?
Would there be any use in this protocol if, say, your main movement is basically what you're, focusing on as adding intensity through the training block, but whether maybe not within the 6-week training block or maybe within, I'm not sure, recognizing, okay, today we're not going to add intensity through the main movement, but try to add intensity, lifting the strength in the other movements and try to maintain whatever we were at last week. And then the next week, bump up our intensity for the main movement and see what that's done.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another great way to look at this is maybe we just shift around the main movement, like the concentric piece, the concentric movement could become the main. So you could actually just take those three components there and shift them around. So that the antagonistic movement could become the main movement, and the outer range specific one could be a little more maintained at a certain intensity, if that's specifically what that person needs. Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it as well too. So occasionally it's, you know, just in your experience with doing these protocols, it can be difficult to make maybe the concentric movement like very high intensity. I mean, it's difficult you can make it difficult for the person to feel like that's really, really applying, I guess, nervous system kind of changes and things like that. It's a little more difficult to do. But yeah, the antagonistic one for sure we could apply.
And that's definitely why I wouldn't think like, you know, it kind of needs to rely on there being an outer range specific main movement that you can get used to for a few weeks and have these antagonists. So you have a certain baseline with all of them, I feel. So then you can know, you know, this is where I need to roughly stay for my main movement to be not intensifying. And this is kind of what I need to do, whether that's weight based or effort based for my definitely antagonistic. And yeah, I'm struggling more with what the concentric would be, but I'm sure
Lots of different options. You can get creative. You can get creative with it too, right? Like I have been, if you go to the protocols group now with this in mind, look at the 3 movement circuits that I've been putting in there. So, you know, I'm showing a lot of variations of how this can be applied, like the ankle one I just did. So now go back and look at it with this in mind: main movement, antagonistic movement, concentric focus movement. And yeah, there's a lot of different ways we can be creative with this. And that's what's really cool about it, is you can think about how you can use maybe exercises that are more of a novelty to other disciplines and bring them into a flexibility strength protocol. And I've done that. Like you see a lot of my background in strength training and powerlifting coming into flexibility training through this type of method. And it works really well. So we don't have to be so subjective to certain movements. You can start thinking about, you know, the disciplines that we're really used to and how they can be applied to these kind of scenarios as well. That's what I'm trying to do with the protocols group as well, is to show a lot of the variety of ways that we can think about these type of movement-based circuits in a flexibility approach, while also presenting a few surprises along the way. So I have a couple surprises I'd like to present into that protocols group. But yeah, this kind of helps, I think, if you're on the call right now, or if you watch the playback, you know, study this and then look at that now, you'll kind of see how they kind of merge together into one. Any other thoughts there, guys? Something to probably go back on and look at, and, you know, message me afterwards if there's other thoughts about it. I'm always down to brainstorm different ideas about this stuff. So what's new research saying? There's always new research coming out, but specifically, I don't know if you guys have seen this one, which Mercedes had shared with me recently, and the whole experimentation piece with this did come from a rock climbing perspective, but I'll put the paper into this playback as well, so you can actually go back and look at the paper on minimizing injury and maximizing return to play. So looking at retraining ligaments. Okay, what should be the application and the thought process here? And specifically what happened within this study is that they found that within 10 minutes of starting an activity, the tendon's molecular response reached its maximum, and that if loading continued afterwards, the signals began switching off. On top of that, it showed that it took 6 hours for the cells to become responsive to exercise again afterwards. So in that study, that was applied in a lot of different ways. So when I share that, you can go back and look at how that was applied. But recently, this rock climber took these thoughts and applied it to his own training. So you can look this up on YouTube. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with it or have seen it, but the hangboard training 2 times per day for 30 days. So he took that thought process of 10 minutes of activity, 6-hour window twice a day. And he did that with his hangboard training. Specifically, he was training like on a crimp board, 14 millimeter board. And his baseline was 48 kilos attached to his body for 3 seconds on the crimp board. And in 30 days, he increased it to 5 seconds with 67 kilos, which is a pretty crazy improvement in 30 days. It was like 60% improvement. So he's just using these thoughts that this research is presenting, is that, what if we trained the tendons and ligaments in this kind of work window twice a day with this kind of rest? And what was interesting, like when Mercedes shared this with me, we got into that conversation of like the protocol and the sprint, because that has been a lot of the thought after all of that has happened, is like, okay, what was happening here that's working really well that we can relate to maybe some research that's coming out, things like that. And this is where maybe this is a thought now. So I just wanted to present that to you guys because I think it's pretty badass, and it's a different way of thinking now, and potentially we could apply this and see how it works. So I'm starting to think about a 10-minute protocol that can be applied twice a day for 30 days. So I don't know if anyone's on board for that challenge. Not sure how it's going to look yet. I'm planning out a few different ideas, but certainly something that I am considering. I think that Mercedes is starting to experiment with this too. I think she's experimenting with it with her splits. So yeah, there's a couple of different thoughts there, but I did want to present that to you guys and just kind of hear what your thoughts were on that. Has anyone seen that yet? It's new. Yeah, definitely.
Hey, so I haven't seen it actually, but I had just this thought that how this relates to what Emmett Lewis used to do with head to toe kind of protocols he used to have, right? There was like, I don't remember how many reps, was it like 72 or something particular like this per leg? And he would do it twice a day. I mean, actually once a day was enough, but then there was this morning thing that the
36.
first thing in the morning you would do it. So then it left people really sore, but I guess that would be the concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely a good one to present to Emmett as well too, and have some discussion there. Because I'm not sure if he knows this research was done in 2017, so it's still fairly new. And this hangboard challenge that this Emil Abrahamson guy is doing is blowing up. Like people are getting into it and trying it, and some people are, I guess, trying to say, it's not long term, as most things. No one really knows yet. But yeah, that's definitely a thought process there with like something like head to toe. And one thing that head to toe had was some prerequisites too, right? So you certainly know that depending on what we wanted to do with the flexibility, there should be some prerequisites in place. We could do something very basic, like think about somebody that just hasn't been stretching, poor mobility, hasn't been doing anything. You could probably do something like a horse stance, a long lunge, a hang, and maybe a little bit of trunk work. 10 minutes twice a day, and they would probably have pretty crazy results. Someone at a higher end, so it looks like this Emil guy, like, yeah, he's on a 14 millimeter crimp board with 48 kilos of weight as a baseline. That's you're gonna want to figure out what that should look like for everyday Joe that maybe just like wants to improve their grip strength. So maybe it would look different as a hanging protocol. So yeah, the head to toe definitely would be an example of this. What requires prerequisites, like Emmett's prerequisites are Jefferson curl and palms of floor pike, I think. Those are the two. Like you need certain strengths in those. So certainly something to consider, maybe side split. Like I know Mercedes is playing around with side split, front split. What should that look like? What kind of prerequisites should you have? Like side split sprint prerequisites, maybe. You could do 10 minutes in the morning and evening. It'd be pretty cool to see, I think. What would come from that.
Because I'm quite keen to try this with the back bend.
Yeah,
I feel like I think that I could get a lot more results in my upper back if I did it on a daily basis. And so yeah, I'd love to chat to you about that because I'm quite keen to try this theory as well.
yeah. I'm big on daily stuff, especially when trying to have a breakthrough. And like before we got on the call, I was talking with James Fuller because he has me doing a lot of bench pressing right now. And I want to do daily bench presses. He was like, no, because the bench press requires weight to understand it. And it's true, right? Like after I said it to him, I was like, yeah, that would be probably pretty dumb because you basically need to be using a weight that you can't move to do a bench press. If I did it every day, it wouldn't be as smart. And if you do a light bench press, it's not going to be very effective. Like you don't actually get much use from it. So that's interesting, Nix, because I think the back bridge is similar unless you did variations. But in my experience, I don't know about you guys, back bridges requires a lot of strength. Like it wasn't accessible to me. And I find most people, especially when we did the sprint, most people got more trash from the back bridge work than they did from anything else. Like, you get someone 2 weeks in, they're like, look, I can do a back bridge. And then they just can't do it after that because it was just their nervous system got a little shot up. So back bend one would be interesting. I'd be interested to know how that would look too. Whereas like if you do a back bridge every day, because even some of the guys, I don't know if you've seen me share some of those guys that are doing the daily. He started using a yoga wheel to break up some of the days because it's starting to get really hard on him. So yeah, that'd be an interesting one. Because I'm still only doing back bridge once a week. And I have experimented with twice a week, things like that. Obviously, I'm doing a lot of other training, but I always responded really well to once a week with the back bends. But I think there's other training components that should be there. It's a good one to think about. And also, if we did a 10-minute protocol that had some sort of back bend in it, what would it be? Would it be like a range of strength setup, or would it be like a standing trunk reach?
Yeah, I was sort of thinking not necessarily do the actual bridge every day, but do a lot of the prep work and some of the strength, the isolation movements, just to more of adding some form of the training components in on a daily basis as opposed to doing every day. So maybe sticking to still like the once or twice a week with the actual bridge, but trying to increase my frequency of some of the back bend work that goes into it.
Yeah, that's cool. So like a rotation every third or fourth day or something, you do like a actual bridge, but then maybe like the Cobra one day, and then that would be cool. That's a cool way to think about it too, right? If you were to do a 30-day, it could be a week too. Like I like the horse stance. We did it a week. Like what can you do in 7 days? Like I like the 7-day thing too. That's always something that I think you can always get some kind of breakthrough in the 7-day approach. Trying to better understand things that way. you guys think? Your thoughts there, Sam?
Yeah, actually, I did see this paper last week, and I started kind of just trying some my last like one arm chin up workout. I got a little elbow pain, so I tried this type of thing, just like holding a curl in an isometric position, like at 90 degrees. I think it said like 3 to 5 sets of like 45 seconds, like holding it in a supinated grip, holding a neutral grip, holding a pronated grip. And I didn't continue with it for more than a day because I did it like on Friday, once in the morning, then I did it once in the evening. And I felt like I got pretty significant like relief from the just like the irritation I gave myself. So I would be curious to see how that would go to continue with that for 30 days. But I'm interested in the other approaches that other people are coming up with here.
Yeah. 30 days is a long time.
Yeah.
Twice a day for 30 days. Because I was thinking it doesn't seem like a long time, but if you're going twice a day, like that's a commitment.
Mhm.
Certainly probably have to think about making sacrifices in other ways as well too, depending on what it looked like. Yeah, certainly something to consider for sure. I don't know, I'm going to experiment a little bit with it, and I'll start presenting ideas to you guys. Tell me what you think. If you guys have like, Nick's is talking about a bridge one, we can probably just brainstorm around back bend and think about how that could work to 10 minutes twice a day, back bend work. That would be pretty cool too, because it's probably one of the most undertrained components, right?
All this reminds me of in Asia, like, every morning in the park, you can see the old ladies and doing some sort of flexibility movements. And they're really like kind of tendon based of what I see in some sort of, kick series or this kind of explosive passive stretches kind of thing. And they do it daily, every day in the same way. And you would think like, now adaptation will kick in, you will get some initial gains. And after that, you have to switch your routine or something. But no, they tend to do it for like 40 years or something like that. And they've got great results. Like you can see that their mobility is just insane. So there must be something about that. Maybe, twice a day turns out to be quite a lot. But if you do even once a day for a while, it seems it seems working. Also, this reminds me of I think Ido Portal in early days. He was advising people. Don't quote me on that. I may be wrong, but this is what I remember, that he was telling people to do a bridge every day for like, I don't know, a minute or something like that for 30 days, and only after that you can start doing some sort of a protocol. And this is a very straightforward approach, and it's kind of dangerously straightforward, but sometimes things like this work really well, and I would give it a shot. Not getting like crazy intensity, but just getting into the position daily. It's a simple concept, but hey, it makes sense.
Bend, don't break, reset.
Yeah.
No, yeah, that's definitely, if you kept it more simple too. There's so many options there. Like if it was a 3-day rotation, you could do like a half bridge and a low bridge and a full bridge. Maybe that's the rotation. Simple.
I mean, the problem with the a minute a day for 30 days, like Ido Portal maybe suggested, is that it's kind of the same with the Shaolin, right? It relies on people being a little bit expendable. Like the people that it works for are the ones that are like, this is great, and I fucking have a great back bridge now. And the ones that it doesn't work for, they just go quiet because they're like, oh, I obviously I wasn't cut out for it or something. You don't hear. And like that's what you want to try to avoid, right? Is one of the people that we're recommending do it, pinging their back and not being able to train back bridge for a few weeks.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that's probably why the prerequisite idea like Emmett uses with head to toe is, which some people I know for a fact don't follow those prerequisites, but it's good to have some kind of prerequisite guideline to trying these things out. Or maybe you just have two versions, this version and that version. But certainly, I think it's cool to see research like this coming out now, that because the thing with flexibility training right now that's hard to break is the thought of us doing less and getting more. That's been a hard thing to break, is like what's the least amount I can do to get the most amount of gains so that I can do other things. It's always been the journey for me to try to present those thoughts in such a way where we can make sense of it. And I think we're getting closer, just with more and more people experimenting with the work and sharing their results. And, you know, like Mercedes, like she saw that research and sent it to me right away. It's like, this is what we're looking for, this kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, 10 minutes of work with 6-hour window. Like that's the kind of research you want to start looking at and saying, okay, well, how will this look if we did this for 30 days?
You know what's interesting about, it's hard to say with the study, I have to read it, of course, but then definitely with the Chinese ladies that you see in the park who are doing this thing, is that there isn't an expectation necessarily of a direct outcome. Maybe that's the case with the study. It's definitely the case with the Chinese thing, where they're not saying like, okay, I'm going to do this every day, and then 3 weeks in, I will now know I'll be able to do this. It's a lifelong practice. It's a longevity thing. They say, I'm just going to, like, there's no question. It's just something like you just go and you do every day for the rest of your life. So like, they're not necessarily trying to hit their max on their leg swings or anything. It's just like a limbering exercise that they plan to do every day. And I think maybe that non-expectation helps make it a daily practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point, Joel. And I think most of us, I mean, that's, I guess, coming all back around to this training intensity and recovery status kind of talk. I had this chat with, I think, PJ the other day, because we were going over some of his new training. He was, you know, he's asking a lot of questions about deloading and recovery. And it's like, I think in my opinion, and I have to find better ways to relay this message too, is we don't necessarily need a deload. It is an ongoing practice, especially if you're more of an enthusiast. Like a lot of these thoughts and stuff like comes from high level athletes training at Olympics, like where, you know, recovery periods and training intensities have to be so calculated that they're ready for this one single day. Whereas, you know, if we're, you know, people, athletes that are just, you know, training, or coaches that are training and trying to learn, and we're trying to do more things and we just want to train every day, that is a different lens, right? Like we want to think about how we go through these auto-regulating, right? Like how do we auto-regulate our intensities? And that's where daily minimum thoughts come into play. And you learn to take advantage of good days and bad days, but structure, maybe we don't need to deload as much as we think over time, like as we have more experience in the game. Beginners need to probably know that, because they need to learn how to control their intensities, because they're probably going to push too hard at the start. So yeah, it's interesting pieces there to tie in the psychosocial aspect of it. You just do it because you do it. There's no expectations of a direct outcome. You just have to do it. We have to squat every day, Joel. That's the thing, right? That's really good. Do you guys have any other thoughts around what we presented here so far today? I was going to tie in some thoughts around the knee hypermobility strategies. Cool. So yeah, touching on that question that Kat had, the hypermobility of the knees, like application with your training as well, has been more about the bent knee position and deeper stress deeper stretches or deeper stretch positions. So what ends up happening a lot in this scenario is when you start to move into your outer range, your body will succumb to moving into that hyperextended knee position to like save, or that's where you feel more safe actually. So yeah, that's cool, Chris. Thanks for jumping on, man. So that thought there would be, yeah, think about more about the soft knee in outer range positions. So we're actually doing that with the Val slide lunge right now. Like we're sliding out to that front split position, and watching you specifically do that exercise, you can see that the sets where I guess we maybe lose strength, the knee goes into hyperextension. So that's like a coaching consideration there, is like we're thinking about maintaining that for a longer period of time. Individuals who are training with that maybe at a more entry level, we would be thinking about, you know, any kind of stretch, like the self-assisted hamstring stretch is good for this, where we're going out into an outer range position and the knees more susceptible to hyperextending. Just being in a bent knee position and creating that strength there. Hip flexors are going to play a big role as well, development of the hip flexors, so that we have strength to avoid moving straight into the knee. What experiences have you had beyond that, Kat?
I think personally on my own training, I've got to learn to control it as much. So I think I've know the intensity and the level where I don't lock my knee as much as I can. It's more of a question because of well, I think women more tend to have hypermobility in the knees, and as I coach calisthenics a lot, there's a lot of people want to work towards splits and are very afraid because their entire life they've been told to never ever have your legs completely straight. The same in here, I've been told when I was about 12, never lock out your knees ever in your entire life, you'll get injured. So I do head to toe. So when I work towards it, I always the thought in my head, like, am I going to get injured? So the go-to to train with, and I was like, I feel a really intense, or when I started with like straight leg deadlifts, I feel a very intense pull behind my knees. So that doesn't necessarily feel like a right thing to do. He was like, that's fine. You're just stretching a part of your hamstring. I was like, well, that doesn't quite sound like muscle. It's more like a nerve stretch behind it. So that's why I always thought, are you allowed to? Is it safe? What kind of sensation is it okay to have? And what is pushing it too far? Because you'd want to feel the stretch in the belly of a muscle more than like a joint connection, isn't it? So.
And in that scenario too, with the hypermobility of the knee can go extended and the quads can be soft.
Yeah.
So that does become more of the focus, should be around the muscle belly, what's happening there. So it's not to say we can't have the straight knees, but then the focus should be on, like, if you're doing a straight leg good morning, how's the tension of the quads? Are the quads keeping the tension? And then we have to start looking at those kind of, I guess, components of it as well. It's because, yeah, we are in that wave where flexibility training is hopefully it stays the cool thing, because it's becoming the cool thing now. But so everyone, you know, we're like really saying straight legs are okay. But yeah, now it's in this setting, how do you coach straight legs, right? Where it is okay. So some of those things to look for with straight leg hinging patterns would be tension in the muscle belly. So the quads specifically in the hips, ensuring that those things are in. If that's not happening, or the articulations aren't being made there, then maybe that person with the hypermobility in the knees has to move to a bent knee to actually understand what we want to have happening at the hips. Lunging patterns, like with what we're doing in your training, we're looking at basically moving you to that outer range with a bent knee as long as possible, and measuring that success with that. So yeah, these are different considerations and things that we'd have to look for. So it has to come back more around to those soft skills, similar to static stretching. Is like, yeah, we know that straight legs are okay. But now if someone does straight leg mobility and knee mobility that's kind of hyper like that, what do I look for in that? So it's the tension in the quads and the hips. And if someone is very capable of performing straight leg actions, but not making those connections, then it's okay for us to perform the bent knee positions.
The long lunge is definitely one of those moments as you lower down from that, you feel the moment when I can control it in the knees, like, no, that just doesn't feel cool. It's just like tiny little range. It's like, I can't just, no, it will just straighten, it will be fine. I don't feel anything. It just feels like it's such a drop. It's like the first thing that hits the floor is the back of your knee. It's like, how? Why?
Yeah, it's a kind of a specialized thing, right? And it's a strength for sure for you with the way you're training. We just want to hone in on that strength so that you know how to use it at the right times, with the right applications. But those considerations that I think are probably overlooked that people don't think about, because yeah, you get into that. It's actually also with internal rotation, this kind of same thing happened where everyone's internally rotating. You got to do internal rotation stretches, but then all of a sudden you have a lot of people who just have access to that position very passively, and they don't need to do internal rotation. Or if they do, what kind of consideration should we can have with that person? So I can sit internal rotation fine. Everyone's telling me I need more internal rotation because it's this very popular thing. So yeah, we just want to be careful that, yeah, the same thing doesn't happen with the straight leg thing. Like, yeah, it's okay to have straight legs and to learn how to move through that range. But in the scenario that there's hypermobility there's those other considerations.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Anything else to tie in, guys, with some of those thoughts there? Or anything else that's happening on the platform we want to chat about? I'll post this up probably today, just so it's there and it's done. You can have some playback on that. So I think the next support, I'm trying to get my friend Waleed, the diver, to do some breath work stuff. So yeah, keep ears and eyes out for that. The Strength Architect guys are going to do, it's probably going to be on another day where they'll talk about the old time aesthetics. We're going to talk a little bit more about diet and nutrition. They're doing some cool stuff around that. So that's coming up as well too. Way back with all that stuff. So yeah, if there's nothing else, then
well, thank you. Sorry to come too late. I was in work. I was at work. Today was a very hectic day, so I will see all the recording.
Yeah, I actually recorded it this time, so you'll get all the discussions and everything.
because yes, I actually don't have any rest. This is my problem. I don't have any time to rest. So yes, I think it's important to see there is the recovery you have between the sessions or during the training, but also for me it's important to think about the effect of the other kind of training we do, even if they are completely different to flexibility training. I think finally there is some kind of fatigue or something that could be accumulate. And I wonder if there is something about this kind of work or studies or something which address this point, because sometimes I think, in my case, I don't get tired by the training. It's bad. All the things that I do at the same time that I don't recover. Mm-hmm. And they finally, they are accumulated. And also I think there is a management of the effort and the intensity during the training and inside the program, but also in relation with the other activities. Even just be, I don't know, something simple, maybe even your home activities maybe could have an influence at a certain point to the others. So I think it's for me it's a tool to explore, but I will see I will see the recording. I'm so sorry.
No, it's all good. I think there's going to be a lot of pieces here, Hernan, for you to connect with. We've had a lot of back and forth discussion about this, but if you have something that you can watch and hit those variables, like we really touched on static stretching and the strength protocol, which are the two, I think the two main focuses when it does come to flexibility, intensity, where you want to put that hat on and know that, you know, you want to work to this degree of intensity in this way, be able to make those connections there for sure.
Yes, yes. Oh, I think finally I try to lower the intensity in everything because if not, I get mad. But it's okay. Oh, thank you.
We're getting there. Okay, guys. I'll catch up with you on the platform. If you have any questions, just drop me a line and we'll go from there. Thanks for spending.
Okay. Thank you so much.
See you guys.
Thank you,
Thank you, Lucas.
everyone.
Nice to see you guys.
See you.